Hello, fellow style explorers. Today we're stepping into the dramatic world of graphic novel styles. These are bold, often high-contrast looks that borrow from comics and illustrated storytelling, where line, shadow, and mood carry as much weight as the subject itself. To keep things consistent, I began with the 16:9 horizontal images, using the period prompt and seed 777, letting the style speak for itself. After that, I created vertical images around 4 subjects: detective, crow, motorcycle, and spaceport. That mix brings together character, animal, prop, and environment. Some are classic elements you'd expect to find in a graphic novel panel and an additional dash of sci-fi. Using -SREF plus the style code will let you try them yourself, but remember to turn off personalization if you want to see them as cleanly as I've tested here. Let's take a closer look at how these styles translate into visual storytelling. 4.9. Crisp panel linework. The imagery is built from flat colors, bold outlines, and crisp shading, giving it the polished clarity of a European comic. Its restrained palette of muted earth tones and deep blues keeps the mood grounded yet dramatic. Most of the subjects settle seamlessly into this framework, reinforcing the sense of classic graphic novel storytelling. The detective feels especially well suited, while the motorcycle scenes verge on stiffness, lacking the energy of motion. Spaceport pushes the style towards sci-fi, but the architecture remains consistent enough to keep everything visually tied together. 5.3. Teal orange vector noir. Vivid teal and orange contrasts light up the imagery, pushing every element into a high-energy glow. The heavy black backgrounds heighten the drama, giving the work a poster-like punch that feels closer to pop art than sequential, comic panels. While the palette delivers instant impact, it also makes the set feel a little too uniform, as if every image were designed as a standalone cover. The detective thrives in this treatment, and the motorcycles finally suggest speed and motion, but the spaceport drifts towards stylized retro posters rather than narrative storytelling. 7.3. Orange teal mecha illustration. Painterly brushstrokes and muted teal skies, set against bold orange clothing, create a gritty, cinematic atmosphere. The texture feels almost hand-painted, blending graphic novel clarity with a looser, illustrated quality that leans toward concept art. The mood fits the detective subject especially well, his trench coat reimagined through the saturated orange palette. Crow and motorcycle both inherit the same grounded intensity, though the heavy painterly style makes some panels verge on illustration spreads rather than sequential comic storytelling. Spaceport integrates most convincingly, its monumental structures and machinery echoing the same palette and atmosphere, keeping the set cohesive. 7.9. Muted chiaroscuro comic render. Deep shadows, dim light sources, and a palette drained of color establish an ominous, noir-inspired tone. The style feels cinematic in its framing, often resembling stills from a suspense film rather than traditional comic panels. This muted approach heightens the atmosphere around the detective, where flashlights and backlit silhouettes echo the tension of crime stories. The motorcycle sequences benefit too, their headlights carving stark shapes into the darkness. Spaceport is the outlier, its glowing rockets feel almost too polished compared to the raw grit elsewhere, but the overall cohesion holds thanks to the consistent chiaroscuro mood. 1.05. Muted earthtone digital inking. Clean linework, subtle gradients, and a softened color palette give these panels a polished, contemporary comic book finish. The rendering balances realism with stylization, leaning closer to mainstream superhero comics than gritty indie graphic novels. The style accommodates the chosen subjects easily, with the detective and motorcycle fitting smoothly into the clean visual rhythm. Crow imagery feels slightly less impactful here, lacking the dramatic weight it carried in darker styles. Spaceport imagery, however, shines. The clarity of detail and bright skies give it a sense of cinematic grandeur that complements the aesthetic well. 2.64. Textured teal orange ink. Loose brush textures, washed-out tones, and moody teal skies give this set a painterly, atmospheric quality. Rather than crisp outlines, shapes are softened and broken with painterly strokes, making the images feel closer to storybook illustrations with a dark edge. The detective imagery thrives under this approach, exuding a weary, rain-soaked noir atmosphere. Motorcycle scenes feel suitably cinematic, though the lack of hard line work makes them less dynamic than in sharper comic styles. Spaceport blends surprisingly well, its industrial structures emerging like relics in a haunted landscape, keeping the overall tone cohesive and somber. 269. Neon Noir domestic scene. Bright washes of pink, teal and violet drench the scenes in a playful neon glow, instantly evoking a cyberpunk aesthetic. The clean outlines and pastel-infused palette give it a sleek but almost whimsical edge, more stylish than gritty. This treatment pushes the subjects into a lighter, more fashionable territory, where trench coats and motorcycles look more like streetwear ads than hard-boiled comic panels. The detective becomes a quirky character, rather than a brooding noir figure, and the crow inherits the same offbeat vibe. Spaceport imagery, however, thrives in this futuristic palette, leaning naturally into its sci-fi setting while keeping the graphic novel flair intact. 378. Grim Sunset Mecha. Heavy brush textures, muted colors, and overcast skies give these panels a somber, weighty tone. The aesthetic sits between manga realism and European bande dessinée, carrying a sense of grit and unease that matches the title's grim mood. The detective feels especially well-rooted here, his trench coat and expression fitting seamlessly into the bleak environment. Motorcycle and spaceport imagery echo the same gravity, though the crow scenes stand out most. They gain a stark, almost foreboding presence that heightens the overall tension of the set. 402. Crisp line suburbia. Crisp black outlines paired with stark white space and flat, bright fills create a clean, almost clinical comic aesthetic. The minimal shading and high contrast push everything toward clarity, resembling indie graphic novels with a modern, stripped-down look. The detective feels slightly too simplified here, more like an icon than a layered character. Motorcycle and spaceport imagery, however, benefit from the style's precision, their mechanical details popping sharply against the white backgrounds. The crow imagery risks becoming repetitive in its starkness, but overall the set maintains strong cohesion through its graphic restraint. 429. Retro linework satire. Flat colors, fine linework, and a slightly faded palette give this style a distinctly retro quality, reminiscent of mid-20th century European comics. The turquoise skies and warm oranges create a playful but slightly offbeat mood, leaning more toward nostalgia than grit. The detective reads less like a noir figure and more like a character from a vintage magazine illustration, which softens the impact of the theme. Motorcycle and spaceport imagery, on the other hand, adapt well. The retro palette makes them feel like classic sci-fi posters or pulp covers. The crow comes across as a quirky inclusion, but the overall cohesion holds through the consistent, nostalgic visual tone. 440. Mythic hero panel craft. Explosive reds, hyper-detailed rendering and dramatic lighting give these panels a mythic, almost operatic energy. The style leans heavily into spectacle, with figures and settings treated with near-painterly intensity rather than comic simplicity. This grandeur elevates the detective into something larger than life, while the crow imagery becomes almost symbolic, bursting with presence. Motorcycles gain a muscular weight that suits the aesthetic, though they risk blending into the same overblown intensity as everything else. Spaceport imagery thrives here. The cosmic scale and fiery palette feel tailor-made for this mythic treatment, tying the whole set together in epic fashion. 450. Clean line comic whimsy. Flat planes of color, crisp line work, and generous negative space give these images a clean, modern comic feel. The palette is simple yet effective, with solid blues and reds standing out against uncluttered backgrounds. This approach makes the subjects easy to read, though it strips away some of the grit often associated with graphic novels. The detective feels more like a playful caricature than a brooding figure, while the crow benefits from the sharp clarity of form. Spaceport imagery works particularly well here, its clean geometry echoing the stripped-down style and keeping the set cohesive. 452. Epic Ink Adventurers. Highly detailed rendering, soft gradients, and luminous highlights give these panels a sweeping, almost painterly quality. The aesthetic leans more toward fantasy illustration than traditional graphic novels, with a sense of grandeur built into every frame. The subjects feel elevated by this treatment. The detective becomes more of a storybook hero than a noir figure, while the crow imagery looks majestic but slightly too polished for the genre. Motorcycle and spaceport scenes, however, flourish under this epic scale, turning into dramatic set pieces that feel larger than life. The result is visually striking, though it risks drifting away from the raw immediacy usually tied to comic storytelling. 469. Retro Varnish Comic. Smooth gradients, saturated reds and blues, and painterly textures give this style a retro pulp vibe with a glossy modern twist. It feels halfway between vintage illustration and stylized realism, more polished than classic comic panels but still rooted in that tradition. The detective images come across as slightly theatrical, their exaggerated expressions pushing them toward caricature. Crow and motorcycle scenes fit more comfortably, their bold forms benefiting from the saturated palette. Spaceport imagery thrives in this approach. The dramatic skies and fiery launches echo the grandeur of old sci-fi covers, giving the set its strongest moments. 484. Monochrome Agent Noir. High contrast blacks and whites dominate, with only sparse touches of muted color breaking the stark palette. The result is sharp and stylish, channeling the energy of crime comics and graphic novels rooted in noir minimalism. This stripped-down approach amplifies the detective figure, who feels perfectly suited to the aesthetic. Motorcycle imagery also benefits, gaining grit and realism through the harsh tonal contrasts. Spaceport scenes, while visually striking, lean more toward industrial photography than sequential art, which makes them slightly less cohesive with the rest. 488. Emberlit Teal panels. Richly lit scenes, glowing embers and painterly shading give this style a warm, yet dramatic atmosphere. The balance between soft highlights and dark shadows adds depth, making the pages feel halfway between animation, stills and high-end fantasy comics. The detective takes on a pulpy, almost heroic presence here, fitting well with the bold light and shadow interplay. Motorcycle and crow imagery carry the same cinematic weight, though they edge closer to concept art than sequential storytelling. Spaceport imagery integrates nicely with the style's dramatic lighting, though the grandeur occasionally overwhelms the sense of grounded narrative flow. 494. Cluttercore toon realism. Packed details, saturated primaries, and playful exaggeration give this style a loud, cluttered energy. The flat teal backdrops and crowded compositions create a sense of visual chaos, closer to pop illustration than the usual rhythm of graphic novels. While the detective imagery leans into this eccentricity without losing too much identity, the motorcycle and crow come across more as quirky posters than narrative frames. Spaceport, however, benefits from the maximalist approach, turning into bright, almost toy-like spectacles that hold attention through sheer density. The result is fun and eye-catching, though it sacrifices some of the atmosphere expected from the genre. 508. Grunge narrative render. Dark reds, heavy textures, and distressed details give this style a raw, grunge-infused weight. The imagery feels worn and oppressive, with rough brushwork that captures decay and unease more than polish. The detective thrives in this atmosphere, perfectly suited to the gritty tone, while the crow imagery feels equally at home in the bleak, industrial backdrops. Motorcycles look powerful but static, more like posed shots than action frames. Spaceport scenes carry the same decayed grandeur, tying into the mood but leaning so heavily into ruin that they risk overpowering narrative clarity. 534. Noir. Voltage panel work. Glossy inks, dramatic shadows, and sharp highlights give these panels the unmistakable polish of mainstream American comics. The heavy use of blue and black tones keeps the atmosphere tense, with every frame carrying a cinematic sense of danger. The detective fits seamlessly into this style, his expressions and flashlight work reinforcing the noir energy. Motorcycles are dynamic and fluidly staged, adding a sense of chase that elevates the action. Spaceport imagery, though rendered with the same intensity, feels slightly too pristine, but the overall cohesion is strong thanks to the consistent lighting and mood. 559. Sunlit retro narrative. Flooded with warm oranges and sunlit tones, these panels radiate a nostalgic, late afternoon glow. The style leans more toward illustrated realism than hard-edged comics, with softer shading and a distinctly cinematic color grade. The detective loses some noir grit under this treatment, coming across more whimsical than shadowy. Motorcycles and spaceports, however, flourish in the golden light, turning into vibrant, poster-like scenes that feel expansive and inviting. The Crow sits somewhere in between, visually consistent, but lacking the dramatic weight of darker palettes. 562. Muted thriller inks. Green shadows and desaturated highlights dominate these pages, giving everything a sickly, eerie atmosphere. The style carries a pulp horror energy, where heavy ink lines and stark contrasts create unease more than clarity. This aesthetic suits the detective and Crow imagery especially well, amplifying the sense of menace and paranoia. The motorcycles feel somewhat less effective, their motion dampened by the murky palette. Spaceport scenes, though visually striking, lean almost too far into horror, making them feel more like haunted ruins than living sci-fi settings. 573. Inked fungal oddities. Dense crosshatching, exaggerated proportions, and pure black and white linework give this style a chaotic, sketchbook energy. The absence of color heightens the rawness, pushing everything toward caricature while still keeping a strong comic identity. The detective becomes almost satirical here, with oversized features that strip away noir gravitas. Motorcycle and spaceport imagery translate better, their mechanical forms benefiting from the intricate inking. The Crow feels the most natural fit, its feathers and form enriched by the dense penwork, tying the set together through sheer graphic weight. 580. Crimson Dystopia Squad. Blood-red backdrops and deep blacks dominate, creating a brutal, high-contrast palette that screams intensity. The painterly shading and cinematic framing add weight, pushing the images closer to thriller poster art than traditional comics. The detective fits seamlessly into this palette, embodying noir dread with striking clarity. Crows and motorcycles also benefit from the crimson-black tension, their forms sharpened into symbols of menace. Spaceport imagery looks powerful, but leans heavily into cinematic spectacle, at times feeling more like dystopian concept art than sequential storytelling. 581. Wasteland synth comic. Dusty textures, neon skies, and a palette of pinks and greens define this Wasteland-inspired comic style. The imagery feels both chaotic and vibrant, with jagged outlines and grainy surfaces reinforcing the post-apocalyptic mood. The detective adapts surprisingly well, transformed into a weary survivor rather than a noir figure. Motorcycles thrive in this setting, their bulk and grit amplified by the harsh palette. Spaceport imagery, though striking, feels less cohesive. The saturated skies make it look more like retro sci-fi pulp than grounded wasteland storytelling. 623. American Grit comic book. Glossy inks, muscular anatomy, and dramatic lighting put this firmly in the tradition of mainstream American superhero comics. The palette balances saturated colors with deep shadows, giving the panels a bold, high-stakes intensity. The detective translates well, looking like he could step straight into a superhero crossover, while the Crow imagery gains an unexpected weight from the hyper-detailed treatment. Motorcycles are dynamic and cinematic, matching the genre's action-oriented flair. Spaceport imagery feels the most natural fit, rendered with the grandeur and scale that echo classic cosmic story arcs. All right, those were the graphic novel styles I wanted to share in this video. I really enjoyed seeing how some leaned into gritty, noir-inspired lines while others pushed towards sleek, futuristic panel work. These are great if you're experimenting with sequential art, storyboarding, or just want that striking, illustrated look. I'd love to hear which one stood out most to you. If you want the prompt PDF from this video, you'll find it on my Patreon or Ko-fi, alongside earlier sets and future uploads before they hit YouTube. And of course, liking, commenting, and subscribing here is the easiest way to support the channel for free. Thanks so much for watching, and let's continue prompting.